Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Special Education News and Noteworthy, the podcast where we break down the latest news impacting special education across the country and talk about what it means for students, families, educators, and advocates. Before we jump in, if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd love for you to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating. Following and rating the show helps more families discover these conversations and ensures you never miss a new episode.
So this week, we're discussing new federal IDEA report cards for every state, an update on Houston's ISD special education restructuring, bipartisan efforts to keep special education at the Department of Education, clarification on Mississippi's special education teacher bonuses, and new research showing colleges may be serving far more autistic students than previously realized. So let's get started.
Our first story comes from Disability Scoop. A new report from the U.S. Department of Education found that fewer than half of states fully met the requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Only 20 states earned a meets requirements designation, while most states were classified as either needs assistance or needs intervention. These annual determinations measure how well states implement IDEA and can trigger federal oversight when states repeatedly fall short. The report also comes as the Department of Education continues moving forward with plans to shift many special education responsibilities to the Department of Health and Human Services, prompting renewed discussion about federal oversight and accountability.
So this surprised me, but it didn't surprise me. I think the biggest thing is that families often assume that if my child has an IEP, then everything must be happening correctly. And what I think the biggest takeaway from this article is that this is not relying solely on like a specific school or a specific district per se. It's about the state. So your child might be receiving the proper services within their school, it's statewide, but the reality, looking at these numbers and this data is that the reality is very different. That not everybody is having an IEP followed in the way that it should be. Goals aren't monitored, accommodations might not be implemented, evaluations might not be delayed, you might not be having meetings, and so on. So it's kind of sad though to think about that only that amount of states actually are following suit. So
Yeah, and I believe out of the states that met requirements, I think only like 3 or 4 consistently are in that
yeah,
meet
yeah,
requirement year after year.
yep.
So there's a long way to go, and this just reiterates why people are so worried about getting rid of that federal oversight for special
Yes.
education and just being like, hey, we're going to leave way more of that now to the states, and we're going to do away with the Department of Education and put special education into HHS. This is part of the reason why people are so worried because these reports are coming back, and so many individual states are not meeting those requirements of being able to be compliant, follow timelines, follow the law for what is required to really deliver appropriate education for these kiddos. So I think, yeah, it's concerning the report cards that are coming out for a lot of these states and just kind of shows like, is this a good time to now be trying to switch things over and to give states less oversight?
Right, right. Very true. I think it's so important for parents just to really be on top of their child services and know your rights and know, every advocacy move that you can provide for your child because it's essential to make sure that they're implemented accordingly and appropriately. So our second story comes from KPRC to Houston. Houston ISD announced it will continue implementing a student success program for the upcoming school year, while state and federal investigations into the district's special education restructuring remain ongoing. District leaders say that the changes are intended to improve services through smaller, self contained classrooms, increased staffing, expanded staffing training, and more inclusive learning opportunities. Parents and advocates, however, continue to argue that moving students to different campuses may effectively change their educational placement and should require an IEP team involvement. The Texas Education Agency and the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights both continue to investigate the district plans. And this is a story, obviously, that we have talked about before.
Yeah, I believe we talked about it just last week. We were saying how in Houston, that school district, they were actually calling some families and saying, "Never mind, your child can stay at their current school." So it's really interesting now that the story's been updated and that the school district is actually going forward with their plan
Yep.
to move some students into different schools. So, it's not surprising. It's not surprising because they've obviously done a lot of planning and I'm sure moved a lot of pieces around to make this work. There is still an ongoing investigation, right? The Office of Civil Rights is still going to look into should this be allowable? And if they decide that it is not allowable, then we'll probably see a reversal of this and those students going back to their original campuses. And then that's going to cause a disruption. So
Yeah,
it's
the
interesting
disruption
to
is
see.
either way. Whatever way you look at it, right? There's going to be disruption, which is
Mhm.
unfortunate. Uh,
Yeah, and it's interesting that they're now getting into this really nuanced debate about placement versus location. So the district is saying that placement is not based on location, that their placement is still staying the same. And that's because essentially they're saying, well, they're still going to be in a self contained classroom. If they're in a self contained classroom, they're still going to have these ratios, if not a smaller ratio. So they're saying that a change of location does not equal a change of placement, which will be really interesting to see how that
it's
shakes out
out.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah. For sure. When I remember when we spoke about it last, and I think you're right. I think we did speak about it last week. I remember being like, oh, like I just had like an icky feeling about it all because I feel for the kiddos whose schools will be changed and what they're familiar with. We talked about transition and how it's impactful not only by on the student but also on the families. But when I was reading this article, not really thinking about that we read something last week, my initial thought was like, this sounds great. Like it's making sure that kids' needs are being met, that the class sizes are small, that they're making, like significant progress with these kids. And then like the further, so like I felt like the beginning of this article really talked about like how great it would be and that like what great special education opportunity it would lead to. And then when I continued to read, I was like, oh, I know what this is about. So I still have the same feeling that I did last week. I just feel like a little icky about it still. And I just hope that there's some resolution and clear cut boundaries, I guess, to determine who's going to go, if there's consensus, if it's in the right mindset for the holistic child, not just because of a location change.
Yeah, and I think it's the difference of, like, in theory and in practice, right? In theory,
Of
this
course.
sounds
Yes,
wonderful, right? And I'm sure that
exactly.
when you play it out, like, wow, smaller class sizes, better staffing ratios, like, more access to their supports and this and that, and then you think about in practice of, like, right, but you're uprooting the children from their closest school to them, their home school, whichever whatever you wanna call it, all any peer relationships that they had, they're potentially losing that opportunity to be with their non-disabled peers. And could it really fall into, and this is where the Office of Civil Rights is going to look into, right? Like, are you segregating these students by putting them into a separate school based on whatever services and stuff that they need?
Sure.
So it's
I
like theory and practice. In theory, it's like, okay, great, you want to
Very
do
yes,
right by these kids. And in practice, it's like, okay, but are you really making sure that their rights are being honored, that there isn't exclusion, segregation, all of those things? So yeah, okay, we'll see how
I
it
do
shakes
I
out. I'm
just
sure we're gonna get more updates on this.
Yeah, I do wanna say one thing, though. I do remember that we had a student that we advocated for their family, and the child was going to be relocated to another school, and again, it was a location thing, not so much so, a different type of programming in a different school. It was the same type of programming, actually. And I remember the parents' concern really being the siblings that would be left back at the school and how that's impacts them, and, I just think it's when you're used to something and it's like what you're familiar with, to go outside that territory is really difficult for the family, so
Yeah, of
hopefully that
course,
gets taken care of.
because these are all individuals and it's not just about moving numbers on a piece of paper from one column to the next number. These
Yep,
are families, these are kiddos, it's gonna have an impact.
yep.
Whether or not they and I know this district believes that they're doing the right thing by their student, but there's other things that go into it. Okay. Our third story comes from K through 12 Dive. A bipartisan effort in the US Senate continues to gain momentum to block the proposed transfer of federal special education oversight from the Department of Education to the Department of Health and Human Services. Senators from both parties have expressed concerns that IDEA should remain under the Department of Education. At the same time, Education Department officials continue to reassure families that IDEA itself is not being transferred and that students' legal rights remain unchanged. Even so, many disability organizations and lawmakers say they remain concerned about how the proposed partnership could affect oversight, accountability, and implementation in the years ahead.
Well, obviously, this is another story that's a continuation, and I think it probably will be a continuation for some time. I read something recently about this and a different perspective on it, and I actually wrote it down, so I put it on my computer. It said that sometimes people hear Department of Health and Human Services and think it makes sense because we're talking about disabilities. But IDEA is really a disability law. Isn't really a disability law. It's an education law that protects students with disabilities, and I think that's really something that people need to be thinking about it. It is about education and not disability alone. And I think that's why so many people, so many families of children with special education needs, as well as advocates, attorneys, I think that this is what one of their biggest concerns and confusion lies. So,
Yeah, and I think it's just reassuring to know that, we have public officials that are still trying to
yeah.
fight the good fight and not just roll over.
Mhm.
As with some cases, sometimes they do, right? Like, let's just not rock the boat. Let's just say fine. That we're getting the pushback that this issue really needs because this is something that parents, advocates, have been against from the beginning. And it's
Mhm.
good to see that there are elected officials that are saying, okay, we're going to actually speak on behalf of our constituents and ask some questions and hopefully stop this because it doesn't have congressional approval.
Yeah, and it's not a clear, it's not one-sided. It's obviously senators from both sides are speaking up, so it's great. Continue to have these conversations because it's gonna help with some clarity and, moving forward in the right direction, God willing. Okay, our 4th story comes from Mississippi Today. After a month of confusion, Mississippi lawmakers have officially clarified who qualifies for the state's one-time $2,000 special education teacher supplement. The clarification confirms that full-time licensed special education teachers who work exclusively with students with disabilities, including eligible inclusion teachers, will receive the bonus. More than 4,000 teachers are expected to qualify and bringing an end to months of uncertainty as districts finalize contracts for the upcoming school year.
Yay for clarity.
Yeah.
This is
Yay for clarity. Yeah.
this is another story that I believe we covered just last week, and it's nice when we get to follow up on these things because oftentimes we talk about issues and then you kind of wonder what happened. So it just felt like something really good to include that, okay, they have come to some kind of agreement finally. These teachers that qualify can now get the bonuses that they are entitled to, that they 100% deserve. So happy to hear that it's worked out.
For sure. And I think, if anything, the story highlights how difficult it has been to recruit and retain special education teachers. So hopefully, this is an incentive that will stay, and maybe some other states will also adapt similar
Our
here.
Our final story this week comes from Inside Higher Ed. New research from Michigan State University estimates that more than 280,000 autistic students are currently enrolled in colleges and universities across the United States, 3 to 5 times higher than previous estimates. Researchers say many colleges underestimate how many autistic students they serve because students must disclose their disability and request accommodations themselves. The findings highlight the growing need for colleges to strengthen disability supports as increasing numbers of autistic students pursue higher education.
So I actually really enjoyed this article. It did not surprise me by any means, as probably many of our followers know and understand that, unlike K to 12 schools where we have child find, but when you get to college, it's really on you as that individual to disclose your struggles and the disability that you have, and you may or may not choose to do it at that point. So I just think I don't know, it was a feel good story to me that the colleges are trying to make sure that they're identifying, or that they're identifying different, learning techniques and strategies that are going to best support students, no matter if they're going to be disclosing the disability or not.
Yeah, and this is obviously going to be an eye opener for colleges
Mhm.
because it's showing that there are many students that are not choosing to disclose that they have a disability. And in some cases, it's probably because they're good without the added supports from the schools. They have their own ways of doing things, but then there are some that probably could use accommodations and are just choosing not to disclose. So because an IEP does not follow you into college, when you do get into college, you do have to disclose your disability, give documentation, and that's how you get accommodations. So it'll be interesting to see how colleges can respond into, okay, if we know that there are a large portion of students with disabilities that are choosing not to disclose, yet still might need supports, how can we make things in the classroom more accessible for all students? And
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, those are this week's top stories in special education. If you'd like to read about any of these stories that we discussed today, be sure to check out this week's edition of Special Education News and Noteworthy newsletter, where we've linked a bunch of the original articles, actually all of them.
and if you're finding these conversations helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you'd follow the podcast wherever you listen and leave us a 5-star rating. It helps us reach more families, educators, and advocates who are navigating special education every day.
Thanks so much for spending part of your week with us. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay vocal, and take care of yourself.
Bye, everyone.